Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am Gerry Pecht, the global CEO of Norton Rose Fulbright. I am delighted to be joined for the next hour by our special guest, the world acclaimed wildlife and nature filmmaker, Keith Scholey. Keith, so glad to have you.
Great to be with you all, really good.
Keith, you have an absolutely incredibly impressive resume, a doctorate in zoology, an amazing career creating many stunning nature history films, innumerable awards. You're the producer of the Netflix original documentary series, Our Planet. You've co-directed African Cats, which, by the way, my family watched again last night.
Hey.
You did that for Disney Nature. You've also done Bears and Dolphin Reef for Disney Nature and so many other extraordinary films. And 10 years ago, you set up your own film company, Silverback Films, and I believe you've just launched a production company to work solely on films that tackle the world's pressing environmental challenges. And I imagine, Keith, you have a whole lifetime of memories of all those moments of looking closely at nature and the natural world. I'm sure there are too many to count, but what are some of the most exhilarating, exciting, or interesting encounters you've had with nature or wildlife?
Well, both of the most memorable ones I've been with elephants. And we were filming in a place called Lewa Downs in Kenya. And they had this elephant that they all knew. He's called Gilbert. He was named after Hurricane Gilbert because he used to knock all the trees down. And the guys at Lewa really knew Gilbert very, very well. And they knew him so well that we wanted to do moving tracking shots with him. This was a few years back. We managed to stand in the back of a Land Rover. And as Will, who knew the elephant, drove the Land Rover away, Gilbert would walk literally right on the back bumper. Now, it's a huge bull African elephant. And we got these amazing tracking shots of him going along. But when we finished doing that, Will always knew this is a dominance thing. Gilbert was following because, Will was backing off. So he used to turn the car around and drive straight at this elephant. And they had this sort of relationship. Anyway, one day the cameraman, Gavin Thurston, and I, we were all out on our own filming, and Gilbert shows up. And you could just see him looking at us. And you could see, hey, they haven't got that guy Will with them. It's just those two idiots who sit in the back of the car. And so Gilbert walks right up to the bonnet of the Land Rover, right up. So he's looking at us. And at that time, the camera door, we used to take off. We just put a bit of wood and mount the camera on. So that's completely open. Gilbert walks around very deliberately to Gavin's door. And I've got stills I was picking away, but then Gavin's in my lap because we've got this elephant and his tusk stopped at the door. And we heard this sucking noise and he just sucked up with his trunk all this dust and everything, put the trunk right in our faces in the cab and blew all this stuff in us and then walked off. And what that said, Gilbert knew exactly who we were. He knew absolutely we were low class and he was a dominance thing. And he was just going to, in a profound way, tell us that, but never meant us any harm. And it just says everything about those animals. They are so smart, they're so clever. And yeah, it was absolutely the whole
Keith,
thing.
that is such an extraordinary story. And I wish we could spend the day just talking about these incredible stories that you have because they're so fascinating. Let me ask you this: what has sparked your fascination with filming the natural world? What caused that to happen?
Well, I grew up in Kenya. I was really lucky, and it was another elephant when I was only about 8 or 9. We used to go to this place called Amboseli a lot before tourism. This was back in the 60s. And it was very much a Gilbert type, a big bull who was completely trusting. I was just thought, wow, I'm just amazed. And after that upbringing, I was always going to be a zoologist. I didn't know I was going to be a filmmaker. I got into that by accident, but I knew my life was always going to be about animals.
That is great. For the benefit of the younger members of the audience who are listening in on this, what advice would you give them if they want to pursue a career in zoology or in the preservation of the natural world?
Well, the first bit of advice is stick with your passion. A lot of people told me when I was going to do zoology that I was an idiot. I was never going to get a job, because who's going to employ a zoologist? And this is back in the 70s. But actually my biology teacher and my mother both said, no, do it if that's what your passion is. So that's rule number one. If it's your passion, follow it, because you will find a way through it. And yeah, no, that's the biggest advice. Follow your heart, follow your passion. Because for anyone who's in a career following the passion, it's easy, isn't it? It's the people, the lost people, are those that don't really know where they want to be or what they want to do.
Well, just excellent advice, Keith. You have said elsewhere that it is the business that is going to save the world. Businesses are going to save the world. Do you really believe that?
Completely. And after our planet, we went with David to the World Economic Forum. We went to the IMF, World Bank, and everything, because we know that the people who can change the world is two things: is where the money's invested, and then where the innovation happens, and where that innovation is turned into practical results. So you have to, at the heart of the change that we're seeing, it has to be with investment in business, so finance and business. That said, I think governments have a huge role in making the landscape right, in terms of investment, incentivification, and so on and so forth, to help business and investors, get it right. And it's very exciting what's happening in what Joe Biden is doing right now in your country, because you can see that whole chain is going to happen. And yeah, we'll win on that basis.
Well, great. Keith, we would love to see some of your work, and I understand we've got a clip here that we're now going to show to everybody.
This is a perfect planet. Life flourishes here thanks to powerful natural forces. Light from the sun reaches us in just 8 minutes, powering our living world. And its daily and yearly rhythms shape the lives of every creature on Earth. Volcanoes are powerful and uncontrollable forces. But they are the architects of the planet, creating over 80% of the Earth's surface. Life could not exist without them. Our oceans are in constant motion. They're linked by a network of powerful currents that carry nutrients around the globe. Every drop of seawater rides these currents, taking 1,000 years to complete a single circuit. And where there are currents, there is life. From mighty storms to freezing winds, weather is vital to life. Rain clouds form and powerful winds carry this fresh water around the globe, revitalizing the land. annual weather patterns have been stable for thousands of years, and it's this reliability on which life depends. Together, these forces have shaped our perfect planet. But it's a fragile system. Today, there is a new force. One so powerful, it threatens life on Earth. Human activity is now so dominant that it's disrupting the forces of nature and the vital habitats life needs to survive on Earth. To preserve our planet, we need to act now. And if we do that, there will still be time to restore the ecological balance that once made this Earth our perfect planet.
Well, thank you, Keith. I'd better let some others ask some questions. I'm going to introduce you. I think you already know Rob Marsh. He is a partner in our London office, and Deanne Barrow, who's a senior associate in our Washington, D.C. office. I'm going to turn it over to Rob and Deanne. Over to you.
Great.
Thank you so much, Gerry, and hello again, Keith. Great to see you. And can I just echo Gerry's thanks for giving up your time today to join us at NRF, but to join our large audience that are here with us today as well. It's very much appreciated on all of our parts. I'll get straight into it with a few of our questions. And the first one I wanted to ask is very much linked to my own personal practice area of renewable energy. I've spent a lot of my career focused on supposed solutions to climate change and trying to find ways to achieve net zero targets. One of the things I've always been really impressed with by the clients that I work for is their innovation and their resilience, their ability to adapt. And perhaps we've seen this more in the last 12 to 18 months than perhaps personally I've ever seen before in the 20 or so years I've been involved in this area. I say that, but it does feel like the natural world is beginning to reach a tipping point. So David recently addressed the UN Security Council, as you're very well aware, and told them that the damage is already done and much of it is irreversible. So against that backdrop, is there cause for optimism here?
Yeah, a huge amount of damage has been done. I mean, in the last 50 years, we've destroyed more of the natural world than in the whole of the history of humanity. So yeah, let's not beat around the bush. The damage has been done. What I still, and I see, there's still foundation stones in the natural world to rebuild on. And I think as we sit today, we're at this crucial moment where if we act now, if we change the way we behave towards the natural world now, we can build on the foundation stones. The worrying thing is when those foundation stones have been eradicated, then you've got nothing to build on. So that's why I think action is very, very urgent. The other thing I think for all of us, we've got to understand that actually it's the natural world that's probably going to get us out of this mess. The natural world still is the most effective carbon sump in the world. And the wonderful thing about the natural world, to let it to operate, all you have to do is industrially leave it alone. You don't have to build anything. You don't have to create anything. And I look at the natural world is our defense system. You know, we're in a war with the environmental change, especially climate change. It is a war. It is an enemy that will destroy our civilization. And in wars, you strengthen your defenses. You don't attack and destroy your own defenses. And I think we need a complete psychological mind shift now to look at the natural world as a defense system and therefore build it up so that it can do the job for all of humanity.
No, thanks, Keith. That's a really refreshing and interesting way of looking at it. Deanne, shall I hand over to you?
Sure, thank you, Rob. Keith, I would love to pick up on a theme that you mentioned earlier, which is that of innovation. I'm a renewable energy lawyer, which means I help companies with the development and financing of renewable energy and infrastructure projects. One of the things I love most about my job is that I get to work with some of the most innovative companies in the world in cutting edge sectors, for example, energy storage, green hydrogen, biofuels, carbon offsets. There are just so many interesting strategies towards decarbonization. So my question for you is, are there any particular technologies, projects, or initiatives that you believe merit focus?
From my point of view, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think there's a general principle is that absolutely we have to get the solution. We don't have enough solutions right now to deal with the problem. So what we have to do is incentivize companies wherever we can to sort of work on those solutions. And I think often people think, well, what we've got right now isn't going to do the job. So how are we going to get to zero carbon in 30 years? I think the thing is, no, let's make sure we're doing the innovation now so that we see it as a 30-year project. So by 30 years, we've got all the technology and what have you created, manufactured, made, rolled out in that period. But I think what is needed now is a massive amount of investment at some of the central things that are producing carbon. And I think, a lot of people talk about airplanes. You'd hear very few people talking about cement. You hear very few people talking about steel. You feel very more people talking about agriculture. These are the areas where I think we need, cement and steel, I think, is 30% of emissions or more. Aviation travel is 16. So, there are these massive problems. So I think it's about innovation in all the different sectors because they all add up. And the other thing I'd like to see innovation in absolutely is enhancing carbon capture in the natural world, because actually that's pretty straightforward. And we know, for example, that bottom trawling of the ocean is destroying enough carbon capture to take out all the emissions of aviation. So you have a lot of people concentrating all the time on aviation, but we're still bottom trawling all sorts of areas for a fisheries industry that actually makes very little money and is subsidized. And we've got to sort of think about how we balance these different innovations so that everything can add up. Again, don't feed the enemy with emissions, don't destroy your defenses.
Excellent message. Thank you. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks. And just before my next question, Keith, just to touch on that, because it's a very hot topic at the moment around carbon capture. Would you share your views around carbon capture usage and storage as a technology, because it's being hailed by some as the savior and our route to net zero, and it's being demonized by others because it's perceived to essentially allow the continued use of fossil fuels?
Yeah, I'm in the camp, we have to do everything we possibly can. So if technology can capture carbon, please do it. If energy can do it, the natural world can do it, please help the natural world to do it. We're not in a place to have internal fights about anything that can remove carbon. We just have run out of that time. So I'm, any great idea out there that brings us down from 417 parts per million, go for it.
Yeah, okay. And perfect segue actually into the next topic I wanted to touch on, which is time. We're here today talking about energy transition and as a firm very much focused on energy transition, but inherently transition takes time. We're not going to move from fossil fuels to renewables, not in a matter of years. We're talking decades, and yet so much of the messaging is on how critical and urgent the crisis we find ourselves in is. So how do we tackle that? How do we deal with this inevitable timing issue that the transition implies?
I think first and foremost, recognize it and recognize the urgency. And from what I understand from the scientists I talk to, that basically if we want to keep below 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, which I think everyone agrees that's what we need to do, if we carry on business as usual, burning the amount of carbon we are right now, we run out of budget. We put too much carbon into the atmosphere to exceed 1.5 degrees in 7 years. So that's why everyone is coming back, the scientists are coming back saying, we have to go into exponentially reducing our emissions. So to get to net zero in the 30 years, because that way we stay within the budget of not going over 1.5 degrees. I think people don't get the danger of going beyond 1.5 because it doesn't sound like a very big number. But all the indications are that we are hitting these, what they call irreversible tipping points, where climate and all sorts of other things start to roll away from us. And this has happened in the past, in the Earth's history, and we're seeing it happening now. I mean, a great example is the Greenland Ice Cap. The Greenland Ice Cap used to be self-cooling because it's so high, it's 2 miles deep in ice, so it was very high altitude. And but once it started to melt, the altitude comes down, so it's progressively getting warmer and warmer at the top. Same time, you're getting meltwater appearing on the top, which is dark and absorbs heat as opposed to reflecting heat. So you get what's called a tipping point, where the whole of the Greenland ice cap will be lost. It runs away. And that's okay, that's not good. But if Antarctica does the same thing, you're talking about tens of meters of sea level rise, complete global disruption. The problem with tipping points as well is that they knock onto other things. So when Greenland goes, the Gulf Stream gets slowed down. And so we have a climatic change because of that. And you get, da-da-da-da-da. And what we know, when we came out of the last ice age, that when the world moves up, because of these feedback mechanisms that kicked in, the world changes, we warm up very quickly and often with catastrophic change. The world, when it cools slowly. But because of the tipping points, and the worst example of tipping points going out of example is the biggest extinction the world has ever had, which is the end Permian, which is 250 so million years ago. But that was completely caused by carbon dioxide from volcanoes. There was a huge volcanic global event, and it led to, runaway climate change, acidification of the ocean dying, emitting toxic gases, all the things we're seeing starting now, because we have become a super volcano, like what happened in the Permian. And the Permian, 96% of species died out, took 10 million years to recover from. So these things, once they run away, you don't know where the breaks are going to happen, where it's going to stop. And that's why 1.5, COP26, keeping that CO2 out of that stuff is the most important thing humanity has to do.
Thanks, Keith. And we'll come back to COP26 actually shortly. But Deanne, I'll hand back to you first.
Absolutely. Listening to you, Keith, I hear you mention that we've really got to achieve exponential reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to avert what sounds like a global crisis. Given the nature of this crisis, that it affects every country in the world and all people on our planet, is it really realistic to expect a global response? Especially thinking about the experience we've had with the pandemic. What do you think?
Well, it can't be fixed without a global response. And I think obviously the pandemic has shown one side. The pandemic is a little tiny slither of what's coming our way, of the environmental crisis. I think climate change is part of a bigger thing called the environmental crisis. And pandemics spin out of the environmental crisis. But we have to view this thing as international and national security now, because we have the Security Council to defend the world against our civilization being attacked and undermined. This thing coming at us undermines every aspect, as we've seen with COVID. It undermines every aspect of our civilization. And so absolutely, it has to be a global response. And I would love to see the Security Council take that on. I am hugely encouraged, though, that I think President Joe Biden gets this. John Kerry certainly gets this. I think President Xi gets this. I think the EU leaders get this. So I think we're coming to a point where everyone realizes this environmental crisis has no boundary. It attacks everyone. It ignores us squabbling within ourselves. It's an enemy that's ruthless and will destroy our civilization. So we have to work together. And I think there's really, really good signs that that's going to happen. There'll be a few countries that are going to drop out, but the big players seem to be engaged.
Indeed, thank you. Rob, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Deanne. Keith, we've touched on COP26 already, and it actually flows nicely from what you were just saying. I mean, perhaps the easier question for you is how important is COP26 this year? But perhaps the slightly more difficult question is, what can we realistically expect from COP26?
Well, let's pick up the importance. So if you think about human history, the whole of human history, humans have been around for 200,000 years, okay? And for 95% of our history, we were stuck as being hunter-gatherers. Why? Because the climate was going all over the shop. It was varying by plus or minus 10 degrees, sometimes in a decade. Then what happened? 10,000 years ago, it leveled off to this period called the Holocene, plus or minus 1 degree. And we domesticated plants all over the place, and agriculture took off. In 10,000 years, having languished for 200,000, in 10,000 years, we went from hunter-gatherers to putting a man on the moon, all because of the Holocene climate. We have no experience of running a civilization outside Holocene conditions, and we're blasting ourselves out of it. So for 10,000 years, humanity has prospered with climate. And we come to this junction, it's called COP26, when humanity sits down and decides, does it want to stay in the Holocene, or try and stay in the Holocene, or does it want to blast ourselves out into a period of complete uncertainty, of tipping points that will take us through all sorts of changes that we've seen in the geological past. And there's no chance that civilization as we know it can exist in those circumstances. So this is the most important meeting humanity has ever had, is COP26, in my view, because it's the last point. Because we've only got 7 years to turn things around in terms of budget, or 30 years, the decisions have to be made this year. So I'm appalled at people talking about delaying COP. How can you waste another year prevaricating about this issue, which is the most important moment humanity has paid? So the importance is huge. And again, I believe many world leaders understand this. Joe Biden is calling a special conference of world leaders tomorrow, because he realizes that if they don't get together before COP26, it could end up not paying off. They're not prepared to take that chance. So, people do get it, and the world has to have a result. All of us as citizens of the world are really dependent on getting a result.
No, thanks, Keith. But returning to our first conversation there, perhaps cause for optimism, even though obviously we are facing some quite catastrophic scenarios if COP26 doesn't succeed. Look, we've taken quite a bit of your time already, and we could very easily fill this hour with our questions, but that would be grossly unfair to all of our audience. We've got some questions that have already come in advance from audience members, which we'll now play by way of video, and then those that are joining us live today will turn to the Q&A that's being fed in as we've been talking. So from us, thank you very much, Keith, and we'll turn to audience questions.
Thank you.
Hi Keith. If humans are the cause of the problems facing our natural world, then surely we need to stop population growth if we want to counter climate change.
My question is, how long will it take to clean up the whole ocean? There's a lot of garbage in it.
And my question is, how do we prevent garbage from getting into the ocean?
Hello Keith, my name is Eva and I wanted to ask which of your programs that you have made is your favourite and why?
Hi Keith, as many young people of my generation, I feel concerned about the future of our planet. If there was one thing I could do in favor of the climate, what should it be?
Hi Keith, I'm Gaia from Paris. I would like to know what will happen if the sea levels rise.
Mr. Scholey, my question to you is, how many different species of animals have gone extinct because of climate change?
No need to worry, Keith, of remembering all of those questions. Thankfully, they were uploaded in advance, and I've got notes of them here, so I can put them to you one by one. What I will just do is remind the audience of the Q&A box on the screen there. You can upload questions into the Q&A box. We do have people monitoring and picking those up, and we will do our absolute best to capture as many of those as possible before the time is out today. But coming back to our younger audience members and those that were kind enough to send through their video questions, the first one we had there, Keith, was that a concern that humans are the cause of all of these problems, and therefore do we not need to address population growth if we need to try and counter climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, population is one of those subjects that, you know, people dance around, and it is difficult. But there's absolutely no doubt that the more people you have on the planet, the greater the consumption, and so the greater the problem. But I think that there are two caveats to that. The first and foremost is people like myself that live in a developed country probably consume and cause about 20 times more of a problem than some of the people I know who live in the Masai Mara in Kenya. So we've got to look at that aspect. And the second thing we've got to look at is that actually, as nations become more prosperous, the population stops growing. So you get to the stage like a country like Japan, where the population is actually shrinking. And this is because prosperous people tend to have fewer children and they have them later in life. So I think the upshot of that, if we're going to deal with population growth in the world, you have to actually look at the places where it's going to grow fastest, and all the evidence shows that you resolve that by building those economies and making those people who live in those places more prosperous. But the trick is that as we make developing nations more prosperous and the population shrinks, we must try and make sure that we don't repeat the same problem that the Western world did, which was consuming 20 times more than other people. So it's about finding that kind of balance between investing in poorer countries and allowing them to grow their economies in a way that their population will fall, but at the same time trying to keep the carbon emissions down as that process happens.
Thank you so much. The next question, or two questions, they were related and both touching on the topic of the ocean. How long do you think it will take to clean up our ocean, because there's an awful lot of garbage in it? And how do we prevent that garbage from getting into the ocean in the first place?
Well, you're absolutely right. The first thing we have to do is to prevent it going in. And it's interesting though, when you actually look at say plastic or what have you, people have measured the kind of proportions of what is in the ocean. One of the biggest contributions to plastic and debris in the ocean is fishing. It's fishing nets lost. I think it's up to 40-50%. So you've got to look at, we can control that, and we can make sure that fishing nets aren't lost into the ocean. And the other source, obviously, is when our waste is not controlled and it's completely just dumped in the ocean. I think there's this other very insidious part of ocean pollution, which is the sort of the microplastics. It's the tiny little particles that come out of our washing machines, come out of our clothes and what have you, and get swept into the ocean. So we have to look at how we do that. And in terms of cleaning the ocean up, well, there are projects to try and do that, but it's an absolute massive task. But I think the urgent thing is try and stop putting it in. And there are some quite straightforward things that can be done quite quickly to massively limit that.
Thank you. The next question, I probably selfishly would have abused my compare's privilege and asked it if one of our younger members hadn't. Which of your programs that you have made is your favourite, and why?
But you know, a long time ago, it was back in the 90s, we did a series with David Attenborough called The Private Life of Plants. And I remember it was David's idea, and we sort of thought, oh, we'll go along with this, but we were horrified because plants don't move, and was it going to be boring? But so to try to bring plants to life through time lapse and all sorts of ways was creatively incredibly stimulating. And I think we ended up creating a series that really, really surprised people. We could say, hey, plants aren't boring, they're really exciting, because through our filmmaking, we managed to get to life. So strangely, I always look back on that. As an indulgence, I did a Disney nature film called African Cats, and I grew up in Africa, and I just spent 2 years with my colleagues driving around following cheetahs and lions, and I have very happy memories of doing that, and I loved the film because I think it reflected those animals. So I think those are the two that stand out for me.
Nice, thank you. The next question we received was, as many young people of my generation, I feel concerned about the future of our planet. If there's one thing I could do in favour of the climate, what should it be?
You know, I nicked this answer from Greta Thunberg, actually, but I think it's a really good one. And because I used to think, oh, well, you can do this and that and the other. And the best thing you can do is completely understand the nature of the crisis. In completely immerse yourself in understanding how it works, why we are here, why it is such a problem. Because once you completely understand it, you will do everything else. Because you will realize it's urgent, so you're going to have to tell everyone else it's urgent. You will influence politicians because you'll want change. You will probably look at your diet. You will probably look at your energy consumption and how much you fly and da-da-da-da-da. Everything grows out of it. So I think the one thing to do is really, really immerse yourself in trying to understand the nature of the crisis, because everything else follows from that.
No, I think that's a good lesson for us all, but particularly for our younger audience members. The penultimate question we had is, I'd like to know what's going to happen if the sea levels rise.
Yeah, I mean, it is a massive thing. I mean, at present, sea levels inevitably will rise. We've set off a geological process, which is melting ice caps, and we're warming the oceans, and those two things cause sea level rise. And gradual to begin with, but it then accelerates. And already for people who are living in coral atoll islands like the Maldives and what have you, they know that they will be made homeless in a matter of years. But then if you start to get massive melting like we're seeing in Greenland, in Antarctica, and you start to get tens of meters of sea level rise, then nearly every major city in the coastal city in the world is threatened, from Manhattan to Shanghai to London. They're all, a few meters above sea level. So I think the point of that is everyone's worried about the cost of fighting climate change. You just have to sit back and think, what is the cost just of solving the sea level rise issue? Just that, let alone everything else. It's massive. So if we invest now, the payback downstream is going to be huge. And there's a relatively small investment that needs to be made now. Heavens, people talk about COVID, don't they? If we had really, really invested in understanding what to do to contain the pandemic, 20, 30 years ago, we would have saved ourselves a fortune. And climate change is the same.
Thanks, Keith. And then the final question that we had there in the clips, and perhaps slightly unfair, but I'll ask you anyway, and to do your best. How many different species of animals have gone extinct because of climate change?
There's a simple answer to that. We have no idea. But what we do know is that climate change is one of the horsemen of the apocalypse of this bigger environmental crisis. And the problem the world faces like now, I talked to earlier this evening about the Permian Extinction, which is caused by CO2. There's another very famous extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, which was from a meteorite impact. And what that did was it changed the surface of the Earth very, very quickly and led to 75% of all species going extinct. What we have done in just a lifetime is change the surface of this planet dramatically. So it's almost, in geological terms, it's like a meteorite strike, because 50 years is nothing. It's it's an explosion in geological terms. So we are combining at present massive change to the surface of the Earth, like a meteorite, with a massive volcanic event. And that's never happened in the whole billions of years of history of the Earth. And life is going to struggle with that. And civilization will struggle with that. So what we have to do is dial back the both the emission, the super volcano, and at the same time put a brake on the meteorite impact, and then extinction, a mass extinction event might be avoided.
Thank you, Keith, and particularly thank you to our younger audience members who were good enough to take the time to upload those questions. That was fantastic. We've had some questions coming in from the audience as we've been talking, so I'll hand over to Deanne, who can kick us off with some of those.
Thank you, Rob. Keith, the first question from the audience comes from Rebecca Sly, and Rebecca would like to know, where can she work in the sustainability industry to have the most impact?
Wow. That's a very difficult question, because I think everyone who works in different places, but I mean, personally, I think where you can possibly have the biggest impact is in communication right now. I think that the world finds itself in this strange place where the scientists know absolutely what's going on, and they know that there's this kind of massive crisis, but the world in general doesn't really know, because otherwise the pressure on politicians and everyone would be massive. A bit like, to fix fix the pandemic right now, the pressure is massive. But the environmental crisis is, as I say, so much more massive. Well, why isn't there that pressure to really fix things fast? And it's simply because people don't understand it. And so the communication business is a really, really important place to make an impact. So I think, but I may be biased because I'm in the communication business. Clearly spent a lot of my lifetime doing a pretty bad job trying to make amends right now.
Certainly, good answer, communications. Okay, here's another question from the audience. This one is from David Marsh. And he begins, he says that unfortunately he's of the generation that in his view has largely caused our problems. He's a baby boomer. So as a result, he worries not for himself, but he worries for his grandchildren who will have to deal with the outcome. So he'd like to ask you two questions. First, are electric cars an answer? And two, is the reduction of meat and dairy diet really going to impact global warming?
Sorry, I missed the first one. You said electric.
Sure.
Oh, electric cars.
Electric cars, yeah. Are they an answer?
Yeah. I think all of these things are an answer, and I think I think it's amazing how quickly electric cars have caught on. Obviously, with an electric car, you've got two other issues. Where's the electricity coming from? So as long as the electricity is coming from a renewable source, an electric car is great. The other thing about electric car, obviously, you've got to build a thing, and most of them, they have lots of steel and all sorts of stuff, so you've got to look at the emissions from creating it. But absolutely, it's definitely the journey in the right direction. Oh, by the way, I'm a baby boomer as well, so I completely share the same sense of guilt as to what we have allowed happen and the legacy that we're kind of leaving. But spinning back though to the issue of agriculture. I mean, I always sort of, I'm a zoologist. I spend a lot of time living in the Masai Mara. For every carnivore, like a lion, you have in the Masai Mara, you have to have 100 wildebeest. That's just how meat eaters, that's how food chains work. If all of us humans decide that we want to be lions, we need a lot of wildebeest. And the fact of the matter, we don't live on a big enough world. So at some point, what we have to try to do is move ourselves further down the food chain, to have less impact. That's just simple biology. So, yeah, I think for all of us, we've got to look at our consumption and what we eat. I don't think it necessarily has to be a complete radical jump, but I think if all of us can look at, the reducing everything by what the scientists say is reduce your consumption by 7% a year is an exponential rate of change. And I think that's quite a guiding principle. And you can look at your diet and think, well, okay, if I reduce by 7% this year, this aspect of my diet, which is costing a lot of carbon, that's great.
Thank you. Here is an interesting and very timely question from an audience member. This person makes a note that many of us will tune into the climate summit hosted by President Biden tomorrow and on Friday. What would be a good outcome of that summit for you, Keith?
Well, I'm fantastically excited by the sort of summit. I think the first thing I hope they will get across is the communication of the need for urgency, which I'm sure they're going to do very, very effectively. And I think the second thing is for some of the biggest nations of the world, who are also actually the biggest emitters, to actually put on the table what they intend to do at COP26. I think if there's some really bold announcements about target, we're already seeing some of those. We've had one in Britain from Boris Johnson, which is really encouraging. But I think if tomorrow there is a real display that the biggest nations of the world are going to really take this thing seriously, and it's what we want to see is that the seriousness is they are actually going to enshrine it in law, their targets. I think what we don't want to see is more waffle, but I think what we're going to see tomorrow is a journey towards setting targets and having them enshrined in law. And if that happens, we're on the way.
Thank you, Keith. Another question just come in here from Ross Moore. Ross says that the French are moving to ban short-haul internal flights where train alternatives exist. What big bang measures have you seen other governments take that you think could be particularly impactful?
Well, I have to say, I think that is absolutely an amazing answer. I mean, a thing that I'm involved with is there's a plan to set aside 30% of coastal ocean and 30% of land for conservation. And if this happens, the carbon sumps of the world will massively increase. As I say, it's the big thing I talked about earlier about building defenses. And I know that a lot of countries are looking to sign up to this. And I think if that happens, we turn a lot around, because not only will that solve carbon, the climate crisis, but it'll solve a lot of the other issues that we've got right now with environmental breakdown, which will help us to have clean water, soils that are going to last a little bit longer, and so on and so forth. So that's the thing I've got my eye on.
No, great answer. Question here from Ben Richardson. Really interesting question, actually. What action needs to be taken to help vulnerable countries to cope with the impacts of climate change?
Investment. I mean, we have to. I mean, my parents were in World War II, and after World War II, there were some amazing economic initiatives to rebuild both Japan and Germany. The Allies threw money at the problem, and right now, what we have to be, I keep saying the environmental crisis is a war, and there's war-type damage. And if you're going to win this war, you have to invest. And part and parcel of that investment is making sure that underdeveloped countries have the resources they need to be able to fight climate change. And that's going to take money. A massive example is what's going on in the Amazon right now. The Amazon is at the point of being deforested to such a point that it's one of these tipping points. It's drying out because as it gets smaller. And if it dries to a certain point, the whole thing rolls into becoming a savanna. And the amount of carbon emitted will be equivalent to about 5 years of total global emissions if that thing is going to happen. So what must we do? We must invest globally in preserving the Amazon and just put real money in. I believe the Americans are onto this already anyway, but that's the sort of example.
Yeah, we hosted an event the other week where we had Lord Deben speaking, and he very personally said that the developed world has spent the last 200 years industrializing and getting rich from it, and we now need to repay that debt. Do you think that's a fair analysis?
Absolutely. But what we need to do is in the developed world is hopefully help them to leapfrog the stage that we went through. And, I was brought up in Kenya as a kid. Very few people in the population had telephones. because there was the infrastructure to have telephone wires all over the place. The mobile phone comes along, and now every guy you see in Kenya has got a mobile phone. They leapfrogged through technology all the laborious thing we went through with telephone lines. And I think there's a real similarity of what we could do in developing countries, so that whereby we can leapfrog the carbon mistake and go straight to sustainable energy. And the signs that that's going to happen, but we have to invest in it.
Keith, here's one that goes back to your advice about the importance of communications. This person wants to know, how well do you think the media covers global climate change?
I think historically very, very badly. I'm sorry. And I've been part of that media group in my history, so I take accountability for that. I think it's, for a long time, it was covered in the way that it was still a debate. Was it happening or was it not? Even by the point, 20 years ago, the scientific community was unanimous, bar a few outliers. 98% of the scientific community saying this is what's happening and here's all the evidence. But it was still, the media still sort of said it was some kind of debate. And we lost 20 years because of that poor communication, and we're paying for that loss now. I think it's improving now, but I still believe that if the media of the world gave more emphasis on this issue, people would understand it better. I think the other area that I think can play a massive role are the arts. I'm surprised that I can't think of a major feature film that's ever been made about the actual environmental crisis we're going into. There are not that many popular songs about it. There's not, so it's not in our culture in the way I think it could be. So I think communication, the people in the media world could do a lot more.
Thanks, Keith. We're coming to the end of our time. There were some other questions, and some of them repeating certain themes. We've certainly been on a bit of a roller coaster across a whole number of subject matters here, and you've been absolutely superb in tackling every single one of them, for which thanks. I'll hand back now to Gerry to conclude our session.
Keith, thank you so much. This was fantastic and extraordinarily insightful. I do hope we get a chance to talk again in the near future. We also wish you the best of luck at COP26. And once we're all able to get back on the road again, we hope to see you in person. My thanks to Rob and Deanne for all the work they did on putting this together. And I want to thank our audience for the amazing questions and for being part of the event. And I did want to remind everyone this is put together as part of our global strategic initiative at Norton Rose Fulbright around the energy transition. We are collaborating with all of our clients, addressing their legal and related issues as they take the journey in this energy transition. So thank you all. Thank you all very much. Keith, many thanks to you.
Thank you.